Welcome, everybody. My name is Dylan Greenwood. For those of you who haven't met me before, I'm the Director of Product Operations for Grouper. I do various different things. Mostly, I manage our education team and our quality assurance team and work very closely with the developers to both assist users like you and also primarily educate them. Today, what we're going to be talking about is hopefully the first in a series of webinars that focus around using AI techniques to avoid more traditional document processing techniques like templated techniques. And we're going to start off talking about some recent developments in Grouper using large language models to classify and separate documents. For those of you who have been joining us on these webinars throughout the past few weeks and months, you're probably pretty familiar with what large language models are. They're a special type of artificial intelligence that is basically just really, really good at processing natural language, long story short. And how we use large language models in Grouper primarily is just to make your jobs easier when it comes to setting up different types of things like data extraction, or as we'll see in this webinar, like classification and separation. And let's just get right to it. We have a brand new classification method in Grouper called LLM classifier. This just came out in a build or two ago. Maybe it's been in the product less than a month. And how it works is really very, very simple. And that's our whole goal with these LLM-based features, is to make things as simple as possible, especially when you're just starting off, so you can get results very quickly without a whole lot of work. The configuration is pretty straightforward. We set this on the content model, and we just pick a model. I'm connected to OpenAI, and I'm using their GPT 4.1 model. I'm not going to bother with any of these additional properties, although we'll talk about them briefly here in a second, and because I really want to show you just how easy this is. Now, this model deals with a set of mock documents I've put together that are more or less human resources types documents. So we've got some forms that are basically employee type information. And then we've got some enrollments like healthcare enrollment, that kind of stuff. So if you want to look at what these documents actually look like, they look like stuff like this. Boop, boop. Oh, I just realized I don't have this web server set up correctly. That's okay. We'll go to a different one. Okay, so this is what we're dealing with. Really kind of basic forms. Now, how the LLM classifier method works is basically just, hey, based on what document types are in your content model, I'm going to put together a list of the different possibilities that each of these documents could be, right? So I'm going to put together a list of document types. So all of these here, employee change notice, employee info sheet, and all of these different enrollments. And then I'm going to ask the large language model, hey, given this list of document types and the document I'm about to hand you, which one do you think is the most likely candidate for this document's type? And then it spits out a response. And based on that response is how the document gets classified. All right, well, let's see how it works. I got a classify step here that we can use to test this batch of documents, not that batch of documents, this batch of documents. And I'm just going to let it run through these in the tester. And as you can see, it did a pretty good job. Not a lot of setup, right? All I had to do was basically add document types to a content model and hit classify, and we're good. Now, you can contrast this. Actually, before I continue, I do want to point out, if you guys have questions, we do have a call-in monitoring our Q&A. So feel free to ask questions as we go along in that Q&A section. Or if you want to wait, we'll have some time at the end where we answer questions as well. But it looks like we might have a question already, or at least somebody's got their hands up here. Do we have anything in the Q&A, Colin?
Did it just do first and last page boundaries as well?
First and last page boundaries will be relevant whenever we talk about separation. When we're talking about classification, it's actually handing the entire text content of the document. You can change that a little bit. Sorry, guys, I need to reorient myself here. Sorry. Where am I? Since I had to switch servers, I'm a little lost here. So you can change that a little bit. So like if your question is, hey, I really only want to hand the LLM, maybe the first page because I know that the content that's relevant to classifying the document is only found on the first page. You can configure this document quoting property to do that. This basically controls what is handed to the LLM in terms of the document content to be analyzed for classification. So like the extracted method would allow you to do basically what I described, set up an extractor that just locates the first page of the document, and then that's the content that gets handed to the large language model. Oh, good catch, Brandon. I think I actually used the wrong model to show you off classification there. So let me just verify for you that the LLM classification actually worked. Got our content model scope set appropriately there. Good catch, Brandon. Thought that actually ran a little quick. And then Rajiv, we are not using a pre-trained model. We are using ChatGPT's 4.1 model. So the one that is accessible for anybody with an OpenAI API account. Okay, I'm sorry about getting sidetracked there. I think we're all on the same page. Before I continue, does anybody else have any other questions?
I think we're good at the moment.
So anyway, just to reiterate, all we've done here is do a very, very simple setup. Set LLM classifier, that document quoting method was set to the default method. And we're just using 4.1 for our model. We didn't do any configuration for the document types themselves. There's no positive extractors set up on these document types. Basically, we just handed the model a list of document types, handed it the document text and said, hey, what do you think this is? And it gave us a response and did a really good job with these, various HR forms. Now you contrast this with more traditional classification methods that are, you could definitely call some of these templated based. Label sets is a big one in terms of templated based classification. What label sets are, they're very, very effective for structured and semi-structured forms, but they are a little bit more templated, which means they do require a lot of setup. So for each document that you want to classify, you have to collect labels for, and labels are defined by the document type and the data that you're extracting from that document. So the data elements in your data model. And it uses these labels that you collect in each individual document type's label set to perform classification. And again, this works really good. It's a very, very effective way of classifying documents for, again, structured forms like this or semi-structured documents like invoices. But it's a lot of setup compared to what we just saw with LLM-based classification. Lexical classification is another method. It is a user-assisted machine learning method of classification where you actually give training to these document types. So essentially, you give training samples or training examples for each different document type. And you may get away with just giving one example like I did here, or if there are slight variations, you may have to end up giving several different examples for its training. And, we've got two potential drawbacks to both of these methods, both the label set method and the lexical method. One is you got to do work to set it up, right? Now, I did all the setup ahead of time, but I can tell you, it's tedious, particularly with something like label sets where you got to capture all of those individual labels, but even something for even something like lexical as well, where you have to provide training and examples. And that really gets into, probably a challenge when you have new document types. Like this one here is a performance review in this, set of mock documents I have. If I wanted to introduce this document to this label sets model, I would need to add another document type, right? So I would need to add another document type for performance review. And I would need to add a data model, and I would need to add all the different types of fields that I would find in this data model, like employee name, right? And I would need to go into the label editor and find that document and collect its labels. Tedious, right? And even for the lexical method, I would need to kind of do the same thing, right? Add a document type, and, bare minimum, I would need to collect a training example for this document type so that I've got classification weightings for the lexical method. Again, a little tedious. For LLM classification, it's really pretty simple. All we have to do is just add the document type. Go to our handy dandy classifier step. Yep, we're using the right model. Run it. You're good to go. And in a lot of cases, it really is just that simple. Before I move on to the next thing, do we have any questions?
Is the LLM essentially just comparing the title text of the document type element to the text of the provided page in order to make its decision?
Yes, initially. And we'll talk a little bit more about how you can kind of modify that a little bit. But yeah, I mean, you basically got it. It's just using, hey, what is the document type named? In this case, I named it performance review. So the LLM is using that as the indicator of, or the kind of context, I guess is the best way of saying it, for what a performance review is. And because large language models are trained on natural language and a lot of different examples of natural language, just titling it performance review is a good enough method for, or a good amount of information for it to understand what that document is. If we named it something nonsensical, it wouldn't work, right? Names are important when it comes to the LLM based classification method here. Now, while we're on that topic though, sometimes the name enough isn't enough. Sometimes you do need a little bit more information about what a document type is other than just its name, right? Good example of this is this set of oil and gas documents I have. Now, this is a really, really small subset of oil and gas documents, but I use this example because these three types of contracts, at least, have a lot of the same types of language on them. So a lease is a full agreement between a lessor and a lessee about, whether or not you can drill and rights and that kind of stuff, right? A lease memo is basically just a small contract that is filed with the county that says, hey, we've got a lease agreement between two parties here, but it doesn't have the full terms of the contract. And then an assignment is all about assigning royalty rights. All of that has a lot of similar language in terms of the actual words that are used throughout the contract, but the semantic meaning associated with all that language is entirely different from one contract to the other. So I did a little experiment with a set of oil and gas documents that I've used in the past for a classification course and just experimented with, hey, how is a classification going to do? Again, nothing fancy here, just using GPT 4.1 for my model. Have a decent set, about 20 examples each of a lease memo, and an assignment. And it did, for the most part, a very, very good job. All of these were classified correctly. Everything but one lease memo got classified correctly, and all of the assignments were classified correctly. And yeah, it got confused between the lease and the lease memo here. And looking at it, it was pretty easy to see why. This is the only document in this set of lease memos I have here that use this specific title, Notice of Oil and Gas Lease. All the rest of them use stuff like Memorandum of Oil and Gas Lease. So it's kind of like a less common way of titling a lease memo, basically. Okay, well, it's kind of understandable that a base model wouldn't know that or would get confused in one way, shape, or form, right? Okay, well, how do we tell the LLM classifier that the information it needs to know? You can do that with any document type's description. This is that way to provide more information, more context in terms of information that the model needs to know to make the correct classification choice. So all I did here was say a very, very brief description, also may be called Notification of Oil and Gas Lease. I didn't actually even give it the exact title. It actually is Notice of Oil and Gas Lease. But even with that description, it was enough, the language was similar enough to this title here that the next time around, it did a bang up job. What number was that? That was lease 32. Bing, bang, boom, lease 32. Easy peasy. And I'll get to your question, Rajiv, in just a second, but I do want to continue on with this point. The other big thing about LLM classifier here is, again, just how simple this was. I put together this course and using this document set for the purposes of demonstrating lexical classification originally. And there was a significant amount of setup that I had to do to even just get this pretty basic set of documents to classify correctly. We had to, let me use this up a little bit. We had to create, first and foremost, a feature extractor. That's what's used to identify words and phrases that are used for training with the lexical method when you provided a training example. Well, if you're using that method, sometimes a real simple extractor isn't going to cut it. And in this case, every extractor you see here, and I think most of those lexicons, was used for classification. That's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, and it's a lot of know-how about how grouper works, how the classification algorithm works for the lexical method, how the difference between unigrams and bigrams might play into classification, what a unigram and a bigram is. That's a lot of information that you need to know to be able to, really adequately classify a document set like this that has a lot of variation in terms of the document type, much less so with LLM classifier, right? Didn't really need to know any of that. All that knowledge about what makes a lease and a lease is kind of baked into the model itself because of how much data went into training it. Any questions about that before we continue? Okie doke. Rajiv's got a great question. If you're sending the entire document to the LLM, what about PII security within these documents? This is a pretty common question when it comes to passing things to APIs like OpenAI. And your organization is going to have to deal with this in one way, shape, or another. What I want to point out is there are a number of different options when it comes to connecting a repository to a large language model. They are controlled when you add the LLM connector to your repository. And you can ignore GCS. That's just something we use internally right now. The two options really are the OpenAI provider and the Azure provider. Now, the OpenAI provider is designed to work in one of two ways. One, it'll communicate directly with OpenAI using their API, and you just pop in your OpenAI API key. Now, OpenAI certainly has a set of security standards. Actually, probably the easiest way for me to find this is to go to this Common Security Questions article I've started. And, they've got a lot of information about their own set of data controls. And the API is different from ChatGPT. They don't use your data for training. They do, in certain circumstances, log some of your data, but there are ways to opt out of that. All of that information can be found here. If your organization decides that is not good enough, there are other options. Along with the ability to connect directly to the OpenAI API using this connector, you can also connect to any service that follows the OpenAI API standard. Basically anything that has chat completions endpoints and anything that has embeddings endpoints. That includes LLMs that you host locally on your own infrastructure, on your own servers. That's probably the strongest way to get around PHI and PII concerns because all that information is basically hosted on your network and it doesn't ever leave it. That being said, though, that requires some infrastructure, may require some cost in terms of running those LLMs. That's kind of the downside there. The other option, which a lot of users are gravitating towards, is service deployments in Azure. So Azure actually has the ability to host OpenAI models as well. And the different thing between Azure and OpenAI is those models are hosted within resources in your Azure account. So in your own tenant. And they don't ever communicate with OpenAI. They don't ever communicate with Microsoft. They don't ever communicate with other customers. It's all kind of within your own ecosystem. And that may be more appropriate for your scenario. And that's kind of the big summary there. You can also find basically all the same information I've summed up in these common security questions down here towards the bottom. And then I think we've got some more information on our grouper and AR article as well. Okay, let's see here. Terrence Abrams, actually, Terrence, this is a great question as well. He's got a question about accuracy. So, his question, I kind of wonder how long you run this to test accuracy and put it in production. It's a great time to bring this up. Everything has strengths and drawbacks, right? The real strength the real strength for the LLM classifier method is just how easy it is to set up and how easy it is to understand, right? Like I said, you don't need to know a whole lot about grouper extractors and a whole lot about the different ways that grouper uses those extractors, a whole lot about label sets and what that all means to get up and running with classification, right? Same can be said with extraction when it comes to AI extract. That's great news if you want to start getting data quickly, right? The downside with LLMs is they are not as templated or hard coded as those methods that do require a lot of setup. And you are probably always going to need some amount of human review to verify 100% accuracy. If your goal is no human ever touches this, you're going to have to work a little bit harder to implement this into production. You certainly are. Now, there are probably simple use cases where you can basically just trust over time that the LLM is giving you exactly what you want. You can use a combination of methods too, if you want to use LLMs and more traditional methods in the way of something like positive extractor on your document types. But, that takes a little bit more time. That being said, though, if you're getting 80, 90% success rates from an LLM based method with functionally no work, you're going to start getting results a lot quicker than if you have to design an entire solution in Grouper using more templated or traditional methods. Did that answer your question? I'm going to go with yes. Okay, those are a great question, guys. I kind of expected we would not get to the separation portion of this webinar, so we're actually going to have a part 2 on this. That should be in the next couple of weeks because I do want to answer or leave some time to answer some other questions here. Terrence, you said kind of. Let's start with you. Did you have a follow-up? We'll let him type. I'll answer this question about OMR boxes first. Does the LLM handle OMR boxes values or only text-based? It actually does handle OMR. There's a kind of trick to getting that to work, though. Grouper OMR is handled by saving a set of layout data to each document whenever a box detection command is run in an IP profile, either during the image processing activity or during the recognize activity, more commonly during the recognize activity. So as long as that data is there, so as long as recognize obtained that OMR information and it's saved it to the document's layout data, you absolutely can get an LLM to return information about checkboxes. You do, however, have to adjust your fill method to use this layout objects quoting method. That is going to pass a lot of additional information to the LLM besides the text itself, including coordinates for those checkboxes so that basically the large language model knows, okay, well, I've got a text label here and I've got an OMR box here. Is it checked yes or no? Okay, so I can answer that question. That's the very, very brief answer to that. Terrence says, what is your production experience using the LLM model? We've got it running in a few different scenarios. We do a lot of EOB processing on site, and we're using large language models to both separate and classify EOBs from checks and a couple other different types of documents. And it's working really quite well. We're also using this are we using this for classification? I think we're working on implementing this in classification for basically an oil and gas type of use case. And I don't have specifics on that, but it is showing promise there too. We kind of just started that one, to be honest with you. But yeah, it's been rolling through that EOB use case with not a whole lot of problems. My personal experience, I live behind a desk and don't get out there in production. So unfortunately, I can't give you much more information besides that. But early results show a lot of promise with these. Okay, looks like we are just after 11:30. Do we have any other questions before we start wrapping it up? So we've got a question. Our template names will be on the footer as a header and text in the middle page. Can LLM handle? So you mean like your document type? It might be in the footer of a document or the header or in the middle of the page. It might be anywhere in the text of the document, right? Yes, absolutely. An LLM can handle that. And if you need to give it more specific instructions, like, hey, you're always going to find this, we'll call it document title in the footer of the document. That's something you can probably use descriptions to help if need be. But it's entirely likely, quite frankly, that just using the title of the document type or the template, if you want to call it that, is going to be sufficient to classify the document All right, guys. Let's see here. We got one more from Brandon. How does LLM handle conflicts? Yeah, that's a good question. Normal classification like lexical, it works off of like a percentage, right? So if you had, these four document types, they'd each be assigned some percentage, right? So like assignment might be 80%, lease might be 60, lease memo might be 42, whatever, right? And whatever is the highest confidence is the one that wins out, right? With LLMs, all that kind of scoring mechanism, it's not as relevant. That's not really what's happening. The LLM is handed a prompt and it gives a response, right? And it's not going to give a response with confidence. It's not going to say, okay, well, I'm 60% confident it's an assignment. I'm 32% confident it's a lease. It doesn't do that. It just gives you, hey, this is what I think it is. So, you don't actually ever get a tie. Quite frankly, you get an answer, and that answer is either right or wrong. All right. Any other questions before we wrap it up? All right, guys. Well, I appreciate your time. We will have the second half of this webinar scheduled in 2 weeks, right, Colin? Don't we do these every 2 weeks?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. We'll go ahead and go through all of the separation side of how LLMs work for document separation at that point. Hope to see you there. It's really, really good information if you have a use case where you're scanning in pages and need to separate them into documents, or you've got like a big, master file, like a huge PDF with several sub-documents that you need to separate out into smaller documents. Really, really, really good stuff if that is part of your use case. So hope to see you there in 2 weeks. If you have questions, you can always reach out to me, or I'll volunteer Tim since he's not here, but he usually volunteers himself. You can reach out to Tim as well, and hope to see you then.